Okay, so in this series of videos, we're going to look at how to create a multi-user chat application. So at the end of the series of videos, we're going to have a complete working version of a multi-user chat system, right? But in this video, we're going to start from the beginning, right? So in this video, we're going to look at how to create a prototype for the server, for the chat server, because in a multi-user chat system, you're going to have multiple clients. So you're going to have a central server that the clients communicate with, right? So what you see on the screen, I already have a project created for this application called multi-user chat, and in that application, I'm going to create multiple modules, which represents the server and the client piece. So let's go ahead and create two modules, one for the server and then one for the client. So I'm going to create the server first, right? I'm going to name this module called the chat server. So I'm going to create another module, right? And that will be the one for the client. I'll call it chat client. Okay, so now we have two modules, one chat server and one for the chat client, right? So in this video, we just focus on the chat server, how we can create a simple working chat server. All right, so I'm going to create a class. Called server main, and this will be the entry point for my server application. Alright, so I'm gonna just create this main program, right? And when you create a chat server, it's basically a network server. So in order for us to create a network server, we have to create something called a ServerSocket. And the parameter to a ServerSocket is a port, right? So in this case, let us define a port, and we'll use this port as 8818. Okay, so here I can pass that port into the instance of ServerSocket and do some exception handling, right? And okay, so once we set up a server, right, once we set up a ServerSocket, we can then call this accept method, right? And this accept method is the one that actually creates the connection between the server and the client. All right, and this accept is going to return us a socket, and this socket represents the connection to the client. That's why I call it the client socket, right? And then you need to put this in a loop because you're going to continuously accept the connections from the client. Main purpose of a ServerSocket is to basically start to accept connections from connecting clients, and each time that you call accept, it actually returns a new client socket. If there are no connections, this accept will block. So that's why we do this in a while loop. So for the sake of just proving that it works, right, what we're going to do is we're going to print out something to the client socket and then close that client socket connection. Right, and the way that we do that is every socket has a output stream, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to just print out some string to this output stream. Okay, so now we can run this. Okay, so it's running, and I'm going to use my terminal. I'm going to use a program called Telnet, right, to check to see if my server is working, right? Because here, the second parameter to Telnet is going to be my port, and that's going to match whatever port I define in my program. right? So here you can see that it actually connected, print out this hello world, which is actually the same string that right here that we are writing to the socket, and it finally closes it. That's why you see that it's got closed by the foreign host, right, which is the server itself. So this is the beginning of a simple chat server, right? So here, we created a server socket, right, which passed it a port which we define as 8188. So in the server socket, you always have to call accept, which will accept any client connections from the server, right? So let's put more debug statements so you can see this working. Okay, so I added two printout statements, one before we accept the connection and one showing that we actually accepted the connection. Okay, so now if I do this again, so you can see that this accept is going to block until we actually create a connection to that server, right? So let's see what happens when we do use the telnet. So right now we're going to print out where this connection is coming from, right? So you can see that it actually says, accept the connection from socket, and then this address, and then this port, right, which is the client port, and then this is going to be the server port, right? And then after that, it's going to do it again. So this while loop is going to keep executing until we actually terminate the program. Okay, so far we have a very basic working version of our chat server, right? We're able to create a server socket, which is listening on this port 8818, right? And then from there, we have a while loop, an infinite loop, basically, that calls accept, which accepts a connection from the client, and then from there we print out hello world to the client and then close that connection. But there's a problem with this loop, right? And the problem is that when you are processing the connection from the client, you cannot accept any more connections. So let me show you why this is a problem, right? So instead of closing this connection immediately, right? Let's say that we want to write out something for 10 seconds, right? So during that 10 seconds, this means that no other client can connect to this server, right? So let me simulate that for you, right? So I'm going to create a loop. That's going to print out the time. And so I'm going to need to wrap this in total, right? And then between each iteration, I'm going to sleep for a second. Okay, so now when I run this program again, and I use my telnet to test the program, clear the screen first, and you can see that every second the server is going to print out what time it is and then send that to the client. So that's all good, except that let's see what happens when we actually have two clients running. So now I'm going to create another terminal, right? And you're going to see what happens when I have multiple connections to that server. All right, so here, right, the first terminal is connected, right? But what happens when I run the second connection, right? So the second connection actually blocks until the first connection is finished, right? And that's because we have a single thread on the server that's processing the client connection, but yet at the same time, we cannot accept any new connections because of this while loop that we have here, right? So this while loop will execute for 10 seconds because we do this for 10 times, but each time we sleep for 1 second. So that's a total of 10 seconds, right? So while it's sleeping or while it's processing the client connection, it cannot execute this accept, and that's basically when it accepts the connection from the client, right? So in order to address that, we have to go ahead and spawn off another thread that is responsible for executing this piece of code, right? And that's what we're going to do next. So in order for the server to handle multiple connections, you have to use the main thread to accept the connections from the client, and then use another thread to handle the communication with the established clients, right? So that's what I'm going to do right here, right? So as we see before, the reason why we cannot handle multiple connections is that this for loop is going to sleep for 10 seconds, and then that's going to block this main thread from accepting other connections, right? So what we have to do is we have to allow this main thread to keep accepting connections, and then delegate the handling of the client connections to another thread, right? So that's what we're going to do right now by refactoring this piece to a separate method. So I can extract that block of code into a method, right? So handle client. Okay, so here I just basically move all that piece of code into another method called handle ClientSocket, right? And then once I do that, then I can actually create another thread, right? And in the run method of that thread, I will call this method, right? And then finally I can then start that thread. Okay, so what I'm doing is basically to create a new thread every time we get a connection from the client, right? We create a new thread, and in that new thread we basically gonna call this handle client socket by passing it the client socket that is tied to that client connection. Right, so now let's see how that works. Okay, so I have my two terminals. Right, so now if I run the first connection, right, and I run the second one, so now they're both executing concurrently. So that's how you handle multiple connections, right? By using different threads to handle the client communication, and then you keep the main thread free to accept other connections. Okay, so let's make this code a little bit more prettier, right? By not having to create this thread, but let's create a new class, right? We'll call this server worker, which is going to extend the thread, right? And in the server worker, so here, this server worker, right? So we now have this. So instead of having this thread, right, we're gonna just create a new instance of server worker, and then we will pass in the client socket. All right, we'll just create the constructor with that. We'll just create that field, and then every thread has a run method, right? And this run method will do whatever this handle socket does. Right, so now we just move this piece into that server worker. Right, it won't be static, and then now this run, we just call this client socket. Actually, you don't need that. You don't need this, because that class variable is going to be the client socket. Okay, so now once I create a worker instance, then I can just do start with that, and then I no longer need this piece here. Right, so now we run it again, we can test this. Okay, and it still continues to work. Okay, so that's how you basically set up the server piece, right? So to recap, first we have this server main, which creates a server socket that listens on a port, and then once you do that, then you have a infinite loop that accepts incoming connections. Once you have a connection, then you can spawn off a worker, which handles the communication with that client socket. Right, so this server worker basically is a thread, right? And then that thread, when it runs, it basically calls this handle client socket, and then from there it basically does what it's supposed to do to communicate with the client. Okay, this will work for a limited number of clients, right? Because we have to create a thread for every client connection. So if you have too many client connections, you're going to have too many threads, and normally when you have too many threads, the system cannot support that many threads. But there's actually a workaround for that, and then that's basically you have to get into multiplexing I/O, right? And that was what we would do next time. Okay, so up until now, we only been sending data back to the client, right? So let's see how we can communicate with the client back and forth, right? So here in this handle client socket, right? Right now we're just printing out some strings to the client, and then we terminate the socket connection, right? But what we can do is we can actually read data from the client and also send data back to the client, right? And the way that we do that is by getting access to the input stream for reading the data from the client. And then likewise, we have an output stream that we can access from the client socket to get data from the client. Okay, so this will be our output stream, right? So using the input stream and output stream, we have a bidirectional communication with the client connection. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a buffer reader, right? So we can read line by line. Okay, so I have a line, right? So what I'm going to do is in this reader, I'm going to read each line, and then if that line says right, then I will break out this while loop, right? Until then, it will keep reading the lines, right? And then what I will do is that if it's not quit, then I'm going to echo back a message, right? And then that message is going to say you typed, and then plus whatever was received from the client. I'm going to have to print out a new line just so then we can have better formatting. Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay, so now when I connect, I'm going to say hello, right? I'm going to send hello, and then it's going to send me back you type hello, right? And then 1, 2, 3, right? And until finally, if I type quit, then that connection will get closed by the server. Right, so do the same thing. Right, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So quit and quit. So basically what I've done is I was able to read the input from the client and then echo back whatever the client has typed, right? So this is really the basis foundation for creating a communication between the client and server. So that's basically how you're going to create the server piece that can handle multiple client connections and read the input from the client and then also send the output back to the client, right? So this basically you have that bidirectional communication with each individual client connection, right? So what we've done today is we have created a foundation for our chat server, right? And then next time we'll work on the chat client. Okay, so if you want to get the project file for this video, right? Also, that includes the source code. You can go to objectxamp.com/ep1, and this will take you directly to the page where you can download the project files. All right, so let's take a look at the summary of today's video. So we learned that we need to have a server socket in order to accept connections, right? By calling this accept method, right? And once we have that accept, right, the accept will create a socket, which is going to be your client socket, right? And then using that client socket, we're able to get the output stream, right? And then we're also able to get the input stream. And then the input stream and the output stream are two ways that you can send and read data. So this is actually a bidirectional communication with the client, right? We also learned that we need a worker thread, right, to handle client communication, right? And this is right, and that's because we want to accept multiple connections, right? Because we saw that if we did not spawn off another thread to handle the client communication, that the main thread will block, and then we're only able to handle one client at a time, right? So that's why we need to have multiple client connections. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.